The last script that we'll be learning as part of this course is a Diwani script. The Diwani script came relatively late in comparison to the Nasakh and Thuluth scripts. The word Diwan means royal chancery, and this script was predominantly used in the high courts of the Ottoman Empire. It is believed that at one point in time, the Diwani script was used as a secret coding of sorts. It wasn't meant to be read by everybody. It was only meant to be read by specific officials who knew how to read and write the script. And for this reason, the script does not incorporate scaling and measurements. And what I mean by that is that we do not use the nuqta as a base unit for measurements in the Diwani script, simply because it was not designed that way. So, to learn the Diwani script, we need to get accustomed to the overall shape of a letter, and that's how we will be practicing this script. Now, in contrast to the Nasakh and Thuluth scripts, where you are encouraged to take your time when scripting the strokes of the letters, in Diwani, you're actually encouraged to write the script swiftly. Another point to note, and something that you will need to get used to, is the fact that Diwani is written diagonally as opposed to horizontally. The Diwani script barely has any linear lines. The strokes in the Diwani script are highly curved. Another thing to note is that the angle at which we hold the pen to write the Diwani script is a lot more vertical than the angle at which we hold the pen for Thuluth and Nasakh. In this case, the pen would be almost at an 80 to 90 degree vertical angle. Diwani does not have a baseline. The script is so versatile that it was simply not designed with one. However, when learning the art, we will be using a stem system. The Diwani script has a stem of 6 nuqtas, and essentially what this means is that 80 to 90% of what we will be writing will fit in within these 2 lines. Now, do know in the back of your head that these are mere guidelines. The Diwani script is so flexible that it actually breaks the rules of the stem more often than not. So do practice in the stem. However, do not hesitate to be creative and break the rules if needed. Now this is the live version of the stems that we'll be using when learning the Diwani script. To script the individual letter Alif in Diwani, you'd first script a vertical line going down from the top stem. The second stroke is a curved stroke where you would first regress downwards, then go right, and then regress downwards again. So this is the shape that you should end up with. The second stroke is essentially a long curved stroke that ends with a flick. When Alif comes at the end of a module, it is not very different than the finishing letter Alif in Nasakh. The only difference here would be that as it goes up, it would turn leftwards near the end. Just like that. The individual letter Ba starts off about 4 nuqtas above the bottom stem. It would go left and then would regress downwards. and as soon as it hits the bottom stem, it would curve back upwards. And using the tip of the pen, you'll create a thin tail end to the letter. When ba, noon, or ya appear in the beginning of a module, you would start off with a small vertical stroke and then a curved stroke very similar to the second stroke of the alif, except at a much smaller scale. When ba appears before a jim, mim, or ya, you can script the first stroke like this. When ba appears in the middle of a module, it is no more than a simple stroke that goes downwards and then leftwards, just like that. So the middle part here is the middle letter ba. Now when ba appears at the end of a module, it is the exact same letter as the individual letter, except that it would be connected right here. The individual letter jim in Diwani starts off with a stroke that first goes upwards vertically and then diagonally upwards towards the right. The second stroke would essentially come down, then curve towards the left, surpass the origin of the initial stroke, and then hit the bottom stem. The last stroke is really a tail end that would curve down and towards the right. When jim comes in the beginning of a module, it starts off with a curved shape going left and then downwards. And the second stroke here is very similar to the second stroke of the individual letter, except that at the end it would curve back upwards. When jim comes in the middle of a module, one of the ways you can connect it is from the right side like this. Alternatively, you can also connect the jim from the top. And in this case, the opening of the jim would look very similar to the initial part of the individual letter, except that this would not be a closed loop. So this is another version of writing the jim in the middle of a module. When jim appears at the end of a module, it is very similar to the last shape we discussed, except that there would be a tail end just like the individual letter. So the initial part is very similar to the middle letter jim, and the tail end would be just like the tail end of the individual letter. And here we have the letter jim. The individual letter dal in the Diwani script starts off with a slightly curved horizontal stroke. This stroke has a slight tail end coming out from the left hand side, just like that. The second stroke of the letter dal is a curved stroke that goes down and flicks towards the left hand side. Just like that. When dal appears at the end of a module, it starts off with a stroke that curves upwards, and the second stroke is essentially a diagonal downward stroke going towards the left and then flicks at the end, very similar to the tail end of the individual letter. The letter ra in Diwani is very similar to the letter dal. So essentially, the letter ra is very much like the tail end of the finishing letter dal. And as you can see from a side-by-side comparison, that the individual letter ra looks almost identical to the finishing letter dal. When ra appears at the end of a module, again, it looks very similar to the individual letter itself. Now the big question here is, how do I differ between finishing letter ra and finishing letter dal? So the dal has a bevel before it dips down, whereas the ra dips down without a bevel. For the individual letter seen, we would first script two small and diagonal strokes going down towards the left, and essentially these are the two bevels of seen. So as you can see, this is very simple compared to their counterparts in the naskh and thuluth scripts. The tail end of seen is essentially a circular stroke that goes down towards the right and then down towards the left. It would eventually hit the bottom stem and then curve back upwards sharply. Now using the tip of the qalam, you can extend the tail end of the letter seen. If it is light, like in the version here, you can go ahead and redo this with your qalam, just like that. And I'll go ahead and make sure there are no empty spaces left behind. When seen comes in the beginning of a module, it is essentially the first two bevels of the individual letter, followed by one final curved stroke that will essentially lead to the next letter. When seen appears in the middle of a module, it is again essentially the same shape as the commencing letter seen, except that the two bevels would appear in the middle of the module like this. when sin appears at the end of a module, it is essentially the individual letter that has a connection on the right hand side. And that's how the finishing letter sin would look like. The individual letter sad is essentially a combination of the initial loop of the letter jim and the tail end of the letter sin. So as you can see, this initial shape is very similar to the opening loop of jim and over here I'm going to go ahead and script the tail end of sin. When sad appears in the beginning of a module, it is very similar to the initial shape of the individual letter. So again, a shape that looks very similar to the opening loop of letter jim. The bevel of the letter sad would look very similar to the middle letter ba. When sad appears in the middle of a module, it is just like the commencing letter, except that it would be connected from the origin of the initial stroke here. When sad appears at the end of a module, it is just like the individual letter, except that it would be connected from the origin of the initial stroke. Just like in nasq and thuluth, the ta in Diwani is a combination of the initial loop of sad and a shorter version of the letter alif. So the initial loop of sad here would end with a flick going down towards the left hand side, and the letter alif here is a much shorter and also a little bit more linear version of the actual letter. And this is what the individual letter ta would look like in Diwani. When ta appears in the beginning of a module, it would look almost identical, except that the initial loop would not end with a flick, but would actually be continued on. Just like that. And the stem would be exactly the same as the individual letter. And there we have commencing letter ta. When ta appears in the middle of a module, again, this would be connected in a very similar way to the sad. And when ta appears at the end of a module, it is just like the individual letter, except it would be connected from the origin of the initial stroke. In contrast to the letter Ain in Nasakh and Thuluth, the letter Ain in Diwani is quite simple to script. The initial loop would start off by a vertical stroke that first goes upwards, then turns down and goes towards the left, and finally it would go horizontally towards the right, or you can script it from right to left as well. The tail end would start off quite high, almost near the top stem. It will go down, just like the tail end of the individual letter Jim. Now, you can regress downwards, just like Jim, or curve back upwards, like this. Now notice that this tail end here could also be scripted like the tail end of Jim. And you can also use this tail end that is scripted here for the ending of Jim as well. So for both of these letters, you can alternate between the tail ends. When Ain appears at the beginning of a module, it is just like the initial part of the individual letter. And this is what the commencing letter Ain would look like. Just gonna make sure all of these lines are straight. When Ain appears in the middle of a module, it is very similar to the middle letter Ain in Nasakh, except I would say this is a lot more casual and doesn't really follow any proportion rules. So this would be a closed loop, and if there are any open spaces in the middle, you can go ahead and fill them in like that. And there is a middle letter Ain. When Ain appears at the end of a module, it is a combination of the middle letter Ain and the tail end of the individual letter Ain. Just gonna go over this one more time. And for the tail end, I would come down and flick towards the right hand side. I would fill up the middle of the loop, and again, you can alternate between these two endings.